In just a moment. Uh, Good afternoon. I'm Mark Plattner. I'm the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion entitled Democratizing China, Insights from Theory and History, by our distinguished speaker, Min-Shin Pei. Um, it's sponsored by the National Endowment for Democracy's International Forum for Democratic Studies. The question of whether and when China will ever become democratic is a subject of continuing interest. In 2013, we actually published a Journal of Democracy book with the title, Will China Democratize? It contains some 30 essays relevant to this question, and these were only about half of those related to the subject that the journal had published since its first issue in January of 1990. And that first issue, by the way, featured a set of articles called Tiananmen and Beyond. Well, it's now more than a quarter of a century after the Tiananmen Square massacre, and China, of course, is still very far from being a democracy. But the question of whether and how it can become one continues to preoccupy both students of China and students of democracy. It's a question that also grips many Chinese, both those who long for democracy and those who seek to suppress it. Our principal speaker today has been wrestling with this question throughout his distinguished and now fairly long scholarly career. Min-Shin Pei is the Tom and Margot Pritzker's, class of 72 professor of government and the director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies at Claremont McKenna College in sunny California. He's well known to many Washingtonians from his previous position as a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment here in Washington. He's the author of From Reform to Revolution, The Demise of Communism in China and the Soviet Union, and of China's Trapped Transition, The Limits of Developmental Autocracy. His newest book, which is coming out later this summer, is called China's Crony Capitalism, The Dynamics of Regime Decay. But to clear up something that had confused me as well, the discussion he will lead today is based not on that book, which is about to come out, which focuses on corruption on China, but in a book still in progress, which looks at evidence from transitions around the world and what they teach us about the prospects in China. So we're also very fortunate to have with us two outstanding discussants to comment on Min-Shin's remarks. Jeff Dyer has worked for the Financial Times for over a decade in China, Brazil, the UK, and now the US. He was the FT's bureau chief in Beijing from 2008 to 2011, after 3 years working for the paper in Shanghai. He's now based in the FT's Washington Bureau, writing about American foreign policy. And he's the author of the 2014 book, Contest of the Century, The New Era of Competition with China. And David Shambaugh on my left is professor of political science and international affairs and director of the China Policy Program in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He's written or edited more than 30 books, including the just published China's Future. Min-Shin will speak first for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then Jeff Dyer and David Shambaugh will speak for about 10 minutes each. That should leave us plenty of time for questions and discussion. Those of you who are on Twitter can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at NE Democracy. Please all join me in silencing your cell phones. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Min-Shin.
Thank you very much. Uh, Thank you very much, Mark. It's been a great pleasure for me to return to Washington, D.C., and especially to NED. I published my first academic article in Mark's journal circa 1992, which laid out an argument that became the argument of my first book. But today I want to preview something that I've been working on for about a year now. That is to take a very systematic look at China's future, relying both on contemporary trends, on evidence from China, but more importantly, on this huge body of literature on democratic transitions since the mid-1970s, to see if we can actually learn anything from the past. So today I will cover just three sets of issues. The first one is that of a theoretical framework. What are the drivers of such a transition? And second question is how likely, given what we know about the drivers and the conditions in China. And third is what will the process look like? So now, in terms of drivers of transition, the answer is actually fairly simple. There are only three sets of drivers. Internal, from below, you can call this domestic societal drivers. The second would be domestic within the regime or inside the regime. And then the third would be external drivers. So in terms of domestic societal drivers, there are two aspects to this set of drivers. One is the increase of what we might call capabilities of social forces as a result largely of modernization. So modernization theory actually remains still very relevant to our understanding of a transition process. So if you break these capabilities down, you will find that they basically include wealth, human capital, access to information and control of information. One thing that often gets overlooked in understanding social capabilities is the rise of independent moral authority. Because autocratic regimes tend to monopolize public moral authority. But in a society where you have strong social capabilities, you will have centers or individuals representing independent moral authority. And all of this makes collective action, organized political action, much more likely. And the increase of these capabilities also occur in a very unique environment because this development parallels a decline, a relative decline, not necessarily an absolute decline, in the appeal, in the capabilities, of political capacity of the autocratic regime. So in fact, you can envision in your mind two parallel developments. One would be the increase of societal strengths, capabilities, and a relative decline in the ability, the capacity of the older regime. And then the second dimension is to look at how authoritarian regimes stay in power. We all know authoritarian regimes rely basically on three sets of tools: ideology, economic performance, and repression. Ideology obviously is no longer effective, so basically there are only two tools left. We leave repression aside. Performance-based legitimacy is inherently unstable because of two issues. One is rising expectations. People in China might settle for a full meal today, but tomorrow they want a Volkswagen. And the day after tomorrow, they want a BMW. This is human nature. How can a regime ever meet the rising expectations? This is really an unwinnable game. The second problem with meeting delivering performance-based legitimacy is the intrinsic flaws of autocracy that prevents autocratic regimes from becoming, from delivering the results that will meet the expectations of the people. So the second set of drivers, let me just explain them briefly, is inside the regime. There's one thing that puzzles scholars, that is, of modern political system, modern political regimes, democracy is the most enduring. That is, democracies can last almost forever. The advanced democracies simply are immortal. But when you look at authoritarian regimes and you break them down, the most sophisticated authoritarian regime still only, well, they last longer than others, but there appears to be an upper limit to how long they can survive. So how do you explain this upper limit on regime survival in autocracy? Scholars have not done a good job explaining this. And I have some hunches. And my hunch is that regimes are like organizations. They experience organizational decay. You might call regime decay. And so the second part of this driver is that while society is growing stronger, the regime decays. And the decaying of an autocracy is reflected in really four sets of developments. One is obviously ideological decay, that a set of principles that guide and provide direction for authoritarian rulers is gone. The second one is organizational decay. And you can identify organizational decay in one relatively simple way, that is to look at corruption. Because corruption is really the most obvious manifestation of organizational decay. And the third is power struggle. Is that authoritarian regimes constantly suffer two inherent limits. One is that they simply cannot develop a credible way of sharing power. There's no enforcement mechanism, third-party enforcement mechanism that can make any arrangements credible. All you need to do is look at China, right? Not too long ago, all respectable Chinese scholars were talking about institutionalization. The Chinese Communist Party appears to have solved the problem. Today, most of us will say that was not right. The other internal inherent limitation is that they have no way of guaranteeing security for each other. These problems are all solved under democracy to a large extent. But in autocracy, if they cannot solve these, so power struggle will be the inevitable result, because essentially the law of the jungle applies inside the autocracy. And finally, again, something scholars have not looked at seriously, that is, in an autocracy, there seems to be, unless you're North Korea, okay? North Korea is its outlier, there appears to be an inherent limit on the use of repression. That is, the moral costs and economic costs of repression are not finite, are not infinite. And so if you examine these, that you can basically understand the larger forces that make it difficult for autocratic regimes to last beyond a certain period, a certain time frame. And finally, external forces. There's competition with the U.S. always gets autocracies into trouble. Second, so this is something I think that the Chinese leaders need to know. The second one is pressure from the West. For smaller autocracies, pressure from the West actually can precipitate regime transition, and regional shocks, such as Arab Spring or the collapse of the former Soviet Union. So this is the framework. So if you want to understand how the overall situation in which political change can occur in China, you apply these. You plug in this analytical framework. Now, let's look at what's happening in China. How likely such a change is going to occur in China. So how does China compare? And here, I think in the democratization literature is that the most powerful framework is that of modernization. And until the mid 1990s, the question always is, what forces produce democracy? But there was this, you might call it the Shwarsky revolution, that is, this political scientist, Adam Shwarsky. He turned the question around and asked a really provocative question. Because the rise of democracy, when you look at the literature, it's really hard to explain. Why not? Because a new democracy cannot be established unless the authoritarian regime is gone. So he turned the question around and looked at what forces would lead to the fall of autocracies. So I think that change of perspective really opened up a new field for research. And here I want to introduce something Samuel Huntington articulated many years ago, 1984, in his the classic article, Will More Countries Become Democratic? He proposed the idea of a transition zone. And the Shwarsky piece, the Shwarsky contribution, shows that authoritarian regimes have a tendency to fall only at a certain level of economic development. So the probability of a regime change, unconstitutional regime change in any given year for at any given level of economic wealth is about 2%. So it's a very small, it's a black swan event. However, it is distributed unevenly across economic levels. So conceive of this curve of probability of regime transition as an inverted U. That is, very poor countries have very stable regimes. Very rich countries have very stable regimes. Unstable regimes are populated, or you find the population of unstable regimes only in upper middle income countries. And that's where China is. So that's why if you apply this insight, you would say, aha, there's something there. So let me give you some data, because I plugged in the numbers from what I call comparison group countries. So what kind of countries are legitimate comparison cases for China? I identify three: ex-communist countries because they share same institutions, middle-income countries because they share similar socio-economic attributes, and East Asian countries because of cultural, regional attributes. So if you plug these countries in, and these are the numbers you have, in terms of, because there are only, when you do all kinds of statistical equations, only two variables have consistently shown a positive impact on democracy. One is per capita income, because it embodies so much information. Second is literacy. All the others are quite ambiguous. So if you look at just these two indicators, this is what you find, is that there are about, I think, about 25 to 30 countries with which China can compare reasonable, in a way that can be justified intellectually. And there's a range. I looked at the year where these countries became democratic. Became democratic might be exaggerating, but the old regime was overthrown. Okay? It was overthrown either through reform, revolution, or a combination of both. The range is about $7,500 purchasing power per capita to $2,500. So that's a wide range.
25,000?
25,000, I'm sorry, 25,000. That's Spain, 1975. The median, the middle, is 13,500. 13,500, and China is at the median. So China is right. So if you say, if you calculate, project 10, 15 years from now, clearly, even assume a lower level of economic growth, China is going to move into the upper quarter of that group. So that's just one. The other is to look at literacy. The variable that scholars use is not literacy. Okay? Literacy cannot be measured accurately. It's the number of years schooling, the number of years of schooling for adults, 25 years and above. This is a much more standardized variable. Of course, there's a range, but the median is 7.5. China today is at the median. So in other words, China, if you look at the social economic attributes, China is a typical country which has obtained a level of socio-economic development. For all other countries, transition is much more likely. And for the Chinese case, China has one unique characteristic in terms of socio-economic development. That is, China's tertiary education is far more developed than other countries because of a rapid expansion of the program in the late 1990s. So as a result, China's tertiary attainment level approaches that of a high-income country. And the political consequences are enormous because once you have, these are the numbers. Today, China has about 120 million people educated who have received college-level education. Chinese definition of college-level education is about between 2 to 4 years. So it's not all 4-year college. Half 4 years, half 2 years. But every year, China produces about 7 million more. So if you look at 10, 15 years from now, China will add about 100 million college-educated students population. So if you look at socio-economic attributes, again, 10 years from now, it will push China into the top 25. China right now is right in the middle. Incidentally, the literacy rate, it goes up by 1. Based on Chinese trend, it goes up by 1 every 10 years. So 10 years from now, this is what China is likely to look like. China's per capita income probably will be approaching something like 18,000 to 19,000. And literacy will be about 8.5 years for adults. And tertiary education, you just said, the country will likely have something like 200 million people with college education. So when you look at the transitions, another question you ask is that what happens to an authoritarian regime that has attained a level of income that is higher than China? So I also plugged in another set of data. That is, all I did was to look at countries that are not democracies, but have higher per capita income, and then see what these countries are. Because the idea of a transition zone is actually very profound. That is, it implies two things. One is that authoritarian regimes will be overthrown during the transition zone. So that's one. The other one, it's unstated, but you can incorporate the new idea, the new theory of why authoritarian regimes cannot get rich. That is, authoritarian regimes, because they steal too much, really cannot become rich. So you plug these, you look at the data today, you actually find evidence. So the evidence is countries that are wealthier than China, that are not democracies, according to Freedom House, 19 complete dictatorships classified as not free. Of the 1917 are oil producers. They steal from Mother Earth, of course. They don't steal from the people. So they don't tax, so they can't survive. 2, I think one of them is clearly a statistical error, Cuba. And Cuba is, according to the World Bank, I think down the street, we need to ask them to change their data, has a per capita income of $20,000 PPP. clearly not the case, right? And the other is Thailand, about 13, slightly about 14,000. But Thailand had a democracy until the military took over. So if you look at this group, one thing you can conclude is that it's a tough world out there for authoritarian regimes if they become rich. Because right now, they're going to break into this zone where authoritarian regimes cannot survive if they don't have oil. Now, if you look at the semi-authoritarian regimes, partly free regimes, there are 9. 4 of them are oil producing. 5 of them are not. What are the 5? Singapore, Kuwait, Mexico, Venezuela, and Turkey. Not Venezuela. Singapore,
Malaysia.
Lebanon, Malaysia is oil producing. Turkey, Seychelles, and there's another tourist countries. So you have to have oil or have beautiful beaches. Otherwise, you just cannot last very long. But so the other question we get asked all the time is that maybe China can pull it off, can overcome the middle income trap, because one of the hypotheses is that authoritarian regimes steal too much and cannot elevate their society into high income. So now let's look at the historical record. It is actually very difficult, at least according to the World Bank, to move from middle income to high income. And the data actually support, even though it's not a lot of data, also support the idea that there is a bump authoritarian regimes run up against. That is the transition zone bump. They get overthrown or the economy gets stuck in middle income. So only 13 countries, according to the World Bank, successfully escape the middle income trap. So let's look at what these are. 5 of them are established democracies when they were in middle income. Japan, Ireland, Israel, Greece, not Greece, Mauritius, and I forgot what the other country is. And then 3 of them are tiny semi-colonies or city-states: Hong Kong, Singapore, Puerto Rico, with strong rule of law. Puerto Rico is practically a part of the U.S., so you have Hong Kong and Singapore. And then 5, actually really interesting. These were authoritarian regimes that were changed into democracies during the transition zone. And then they became high income. Spain, Portugal, Greece, Taiwan, and South Korea. Only 1 autocracy moved from middle income to high income, but that's because of oil. Equatorial Guinea. So again, history does not offer a very uplifting picture for leaders in Beijing, because unless they say we're different, of course that shuts off the debate, but does not change history. Now, when you look at some notable social developments in China, I would play a lot of emphasis on the rise of Christian groups. This in China, an explosive growth of Christianity over the last 25 years. Right now, at least 100 million people who are Christian believers. And another the potential social group is business groups and professionals. So far, these 2 groups have been politically acquiescent. But and our good friend Andy Nathan said the puzzle of the Chinese middle class is there's no puzzle there. That is, if I were the Communist Party, I would be very worried about a group of people who have the capabilities. Because once they have the capabilities, when and whether they use their capabilities for political change is not important. The important thing is that they have the capabilities. That's why, when the moment is right, these groups will be energized. Okay. Yeah. And now let's look at a quicker look at regime decay. Is that post Tiananmen, China's leaders actually spent a lot of time constructing a very fragile system that maintained regime cohesion, largely through sharing the spoils, uh, otherwise known as corruption. Uh, but that system is gone. Today, the post-Tiananmen system no longer exists, and the elite unity has been completely shattered on all dimensions. And I would venture this statement. I think the Chinese ruling elites are more confused, worried, fearful, and resentful than any time since the end of the Cultural Revolution. This is not too strong a statement. Just they are told they have no direction because they don't know where to move. Just within the last 3 years, things have changed so much. So now let me look at how things are going to play out. As I said, regime transition is a low probability event. But when you look at history of the last 40 years, essentially regime change happens in two stages. One is a long period of decline, roughly about 10, 15 years. And there's a logic to 10, 15 years. Typically, it embodies the 2 terms of one leader and 1 term of his successor. So it's essentially a process of what I would call hope destruction or disillusionment. Because at the beginning of this decaying process, most of the people would give the old regime a chance to turn things around. But as a new leader goes into his second term or he's succeeded by his successor and nothing changes, then I think radicalization tends to occur. So if you want me to pinpoint the starting date of this decline in China, I would say 2012. The Bolshevik case would be a very good sort of benchmark. And then, of course, it coincides with China's economic slowdown, which began in 2011. Also, I think in this process is that it involves a full realization that this decline is not cyclical, but structural. And it comes not from the economy, but from the body politic itself. So it really takes about 10, 15 years for this kind of realization to sink and become the consensus. The breakdown, the second stage, is very sudden and completely unanticipated. The breakdown is caused by accidents, by shocks that are totally unpredictable. So let me conclude by saying that if changes should occur, we know about the process, about the stage, the two-stage process. So what would be the mode of transition? Again, borrowing from Huntington, there are only 3 ways regimes change. Through reform, from the top down, the elites understand the writing is on the wall, they've got to change, and they initiate change before the window of opportunity is closed. They initiate change before they become too weak. The second is revolution, that is an uprising, popular protest, and the third one is a combination of both. I call this revolution. You start with reform. This is my first book. You start with reform, but you end up with revolution. So where China would lead, of course. I think the reform window, I think it's, you can either say it's closing or it has closed. I think it's not going to remain open forever. Revolution, I think it's unlikely because revolution involves a split of the elites. And I looked at 15 cases of revolution. 5 of them involve disputed elections, and China does not have elections. So that's 3 involves military defeat overseas. So that again is a sort of a red line for people in power, and uh, three involved outside shocks. So if you think about China's future, a revolution is unlikely. I think the much more likely would be revolution. You can envision a scenario in which, say, 2025, 2030, long-term decline, elites were desperate, they put in somebody who who was given a lot of authority to take China into new direction, and then the elites got split, but in this short period of time, society got freed up, energized, mobilized, and tried to take the country in a very different direction. And if you think about it, that's China in the 1980s. And it ended with 1989, and it was a very close call. So I think I'll end up on a semi-optimistic note.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I have some questions, but I'll save them. Let's go to Jeff Dyer next then.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to NED and to Mark for inviting me to be here today. It's a real great pleasure to be here. It's excellent to be on a panel with David, but I'm particularly pleased to be sitting here talking alongside Min-Shin Pei. I vividly remember when his last book came out, which was almost a decade ago, Trap Transition, and I was a journalist working in China at the time. And sometimes when you're a reporter, the reality of what you're seeing is almost too close to your face. You don't quite get the broader strokes of it. And then every now and again along comes a book that's almost a sort of a eureka moment that just makes sense of everything that you're seeing around you. And I think that Trap Transition was very much one of those books. I mean, the central underlying thesis is that the Communist Party system had just become clogged by vested interests and powerful groups within the party who were just stopping reform from happening and who were just looking after their own interests. And at the time, the reaction from the sort of professional China watching community was, I think I would say, and I'll use a very precise political science term, was a little bit sniffy at the time to Min-Shin's book. I mean, a lot of Min-Shin's colleagues thought he was being too pessimistic, that he just really underestimated the sense of dynamism that existed within China, not just Chinese society and economy, but within the party system. But a decade later, that core insight is basically conventional wisdom. I mean, it's any analysis these days of either previous governor Wen Jiabao's economic reforms or Xi Jinping's economic reforms, the core issue is the vested interests, can they be overcome? Any analysis of all the political intrigue, the Zhou Yongkang case and Bo Xilai's may be a little bit more complicated, but it ultimately comes down to the sense of interest groups and trying to break down these power barons within the system. So it was a very powerful book that had a strong impression on the way I think about China. So very pleased to be here today. Min-Shin laid out three categories, if you like, of ways of thinking about pressures towards democratization: regime decay, societal pressure, and external factors. I don't know this, haven't decided, but we didn't confirm this beforehand, but I'm slightly guessing that David will want to talk a lot about regime decay because he's been writing a storm about this over the last couple of years. So I thought I'd maybe leave off that particular topic and just talk a bit about societal pressure and a bit about the external factors. Societal pressure, just to give a few sort of journalistic insights, if you like, and then I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the external factors just because it's the one area where I have some areas of disagreement with Min-Shin. So I thought in the interest of maybe seeming impertinent but sparking debate, I'll talk a little bit more about that, even though he didn't bring up too much of it in his own talk. But just on the terms of societal pressures, it's incredibly interesting to hear someone just talking so openly about China and modernization theory, which I think is very, very interesting and important, because it's really kind of fallen out of fashion in the last decade or so. Because the party has survived and surprised people by surviving so well since Tiananmen, it's almost become a sort of conventional wisdom that China's beaten modernization theory, that it doesn't really count in the Chinese case. They're the exception to the rule. They're the sui generis example. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. I really agree with Min-Shin. I'll give you two kind of more journalistic type insights to explain why I think that. One is to say that middle class politics in China is already completely different. If you live in a smart area in Beijing or smart area in Shanghai, the way that politics is conducted is already utterly, utterly different from the way it is for much poorer sections of the society. If you try to put a new road through a smart housing complex in Shanghai or Beijing, there will immediately be a very vigorous protest movement. They will all have friends in the local government, they'll have friends in the media, they'll have friends in the security services. It's much harder to repress them. And there are a whole series of cases in the last decade where these kinds of types of projects that impinged on the interests of people in upper middle class areas were blocked. What I conclude from that is that the problem with modernization theory is not that it doesn't apply to China, it's just that it hasn't been tested yet. And my own personal favorite statistic is not necessarily GDP numbers, it's the car ownership figures, which I think are actually the single most interesting statistic about modern China, because China is the biggest car market in the world now, which tells you a lot about the scale of its economy. It has huge environmental implications. But the percentage of people who own a car, I think, is still only about 6 or 7%. So when we think about middle class as being not just the sort of investment bank definition of people who can buy modern consumer goods, but think of it in a deeper sense of a bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie is still rather shallow in China. So to go back to the basic point, it's not that modernization theory has failed, it just hasn't faced the real test yet in China. That's to come the next decade and the decade after that. And the second more anecdotal observation was just to think about it in terms of the aspirations of young middle class people in China. And the way I frame that would just say, if you got a whole bunch of young Chinese students in a room and want to talk about them about the future of the country and political trends, if you ask the question, do you want to see a multi-party democracy in China, a lot of them would have a very negative, instinctive response to that. They will come back at you with very detailed descriptions of Bush versus Gore and what a disaster that is. I'm sure they're all over Donald Trump, and they'll have almost quite a kind of nationalist reaction against the idea of kind of Western political system imposing itself on China. But if you frame the question in a slightly different way, if you say to them, are you happy that the Chinese Communist Party will retain the power to censor the media and censor information on the internet in the way it does at the moment, or would you like to see a more open media environment? They will say, well, of course we want to see a more open media environment. I mean, why are you asking me this silly question, you crazy foreigner? I mean, it's just obvious to them that that's the way it should be. And if you ask the question, are you happy with the Communist Party controlling the legal system, the judicial process, or would you like to see more space for individual people and their businesses to pursue their own interests through a legal system that has some sense of impartiality and transparency? We'll say, of course we want to see that. Again, why are you asking me this? And have you asked, would you like to have more space for not just NGOs, but just general for societal groups, for clubs, for organizations, more space in society to organize yourself separately from the kind of suffocating umbrella of the Communist Party? They'll say, well, of course we want to see that. So implicit in that is an aspiration and an expectation that the Chinese political system will become much more plural, not necessarily democratic, but a much more plural over the next decade. And if the party doesn't meet that aspiration, and over the last 5, 8 years, whatever your time frame, it has very much gone in the opposite direction, there will be some sort of reckoning. And Minchin goes into all the different ways that might come about, but there will be some sort of confrontation between the party and the middle class in some way. So that's my kind of very shallow journalistic take on the societal pressures. But let me talk a little bit more about the external part of this and how I think these pressures are going to play out on democratization and how that process might impact China's relations with the world, with the region, what it will mean for foreign policy. And it's very fascinating the way that Minchin frames it in his piece, because it's almost the complete opposite of the way that the U.S. government and the Pentagon are thinking about these things at the moment. The kind of the mood in Washington at the moment is very much, we're now in for 2 or 3 decades of great power competition with China. We need to prepare ourselves. They have become not quite as good as us, but they have capabilities that are almost on our level, and we need to invest in a whole new area of capabilities to keep ahead of them. So Minchin raises the sort of the Cold War prospect that in some way this military competition might help to undermine the Chinese economy and almost bankrupt the system. The mood in Washington at the moment is the complete opposite. Is what can we do to stay ahead? How can we stop them from catching up with us? It's a much more anxious, nervous, backward-looking, nervous kind of mentality, not about the way that the military competition might actually be the thing that undermines China. But in his writing, he does put forward, I think, a relatively benign idea of what a more democratic China would mean for relations with the US and for the region. I mean, he does outline some scenarios in which a chaotic breakup of the system would cause all sorts of problems for the region. But generally, his argument is, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here, but that the underlying core factor in US-China competition is ideological. And if you take away the authoritarian Leninist aspects of the Chinese system, if you introduce a more democratic Chinese system, by its nature, the competition with the US will become less intense. And then you will have a better relationship with the US, and therefore a more stable, harmonious regional outcome as well. Clearly, with the case of Korea, I think that's absolutely true. Most of the Chinese government now takes the view that they've picked the wrong Korea, if you like, and that if the Communist Party was to become less important, those ideological links with North Korea would disappear very quickly, and China would quite swiftly, I think, change its policy in Korea. But when you look at all the range of the other challenges about Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, I'm not quite so sure. I'd have a slightly less optimistic outlook. And there are a couple of reasons why. In his writing on this, Minchin talks about how rare it is in the past for authoritarian regimes under pressure to lash out against, to seek some sort of conflict to retain their legitimacy, to kind of curry popular opinion when their back is against the wall. And then the only two examples you could find were the case in Cyprus, when the Greek military essentially organized a coup in 1974, when the Greek military was under pressure, and then in Argentina, when Argentina invaded the Falklands, and when the dictatorship was under pressure there. Now, as it happens, I'm both British and a quarter Greek Cypriot. So it might be that my own personal experiences have given me a fairly uniquely sensitive viewpoint on that particular issue. But I think that lashing out is not necessarily... The danger with China is not that it makes some big land grab. The danger is that a Chinese Communist Party that feels itself under pressure will just accept more and more risk. Will just push the boat out a little bit further here, a little bit further there, provoke a bit more here, provoke a bit more there. And the risk of competition with China is not that one or other side wants to get into war, but that you get an accident or miscalculation that quickly escalates. That scenario seems to me eminently possible under a situation where the Chinese Communist Party is facing intense political pressures domestically to reform, to change the way it behaves. The second part of that, I think, has to do with nationalism and the power of nationalism in modern China, which I think in between the lines, perhaps I would say is more important than mentioned. And particularly I'm talking about the kind of victim nationalism that China has really embraced the last couple of decades, the patriotic education that emphasizes 100 years of humiliation and the world's against us. We all need to stand up together to stand up for a strong China. Now, this is something that the Communist Party has very much inculcated and promoted since Tiananmen, but it's not something that the Communist Party invented. It's really an intellectual tradition in China that predates the Communist Party. A lot of it goes back to the 20s and 30s in Chiang Kai-shek. And to me, it's something that's much more deeply wired into almost the experience of urban China and modernity. And it seems to be something that will still very much be there under a more democratic, under a different political system. You'll still have that DNA of this kind of victim nationalism, which will shape in some way a different Chinese regime thinks about the world and thinks about its relations with the US and with the region. The third is just how the dynamic of a democratization process would work in China. One of Minchin's scenarios, it is that you would essentially get the inheritors of Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang, the reformers from the 1980s, would be the ones who would drive this process. And if that was the case, it would be a very benign scenario for relations with the rest of the world. Those were guys who had a much more they're much more open-minded about lots of the ethnic issues in Tibet and Xinjiang, and also about lots of regional relations and foreign policy relations. But I suspect the dynamic would probably be a little bit different. That if you have a group of people who are ultimately challenging the status quo within the Communist Party, it seems to me quite likely that group would in some way want to don the nationalist garb as a way of of boosting their own legitimacy in order to take on the established authority within the party. So it seems to be quite likely that the way that might play out would be the people trying to change the system would be using nationalism as a way of promoting a more liberal political agenda rather than the other way around. Obviously, it's a very speculative one, but just the underlying dynamic seems to be that's one of the more likely scenarios. And then the last one would be about just the US. The last point I make would just be about US and China. And in my own reading, it clearly ideology and the different political systems is a big driving factor in the growing competition between the two countries. But in my reading, there's a lot more about geopolitics in there. There's a lot more about history, about geography, about power. It's not China is doing the things it's doing. It has a more aggressive foreign policy, not just to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party, because it's responding to something deeper about the way that China sees the world, sees its history, understands its role in the region. And the way I describe that is that China's various foreign policy strategies and ideas that it's trying to promote, but ultimately what has been driving China over the last decade in its more ambitious, some would say aggressive foreign policy, is a deep-seated instinct. And that instinct is that China's natural place in the world is to be the dominant power in Asia. And that seems to be something that would like to transcend through into a different political system and will inevitably involve some kind of competition challenge with the US, where in the US the ultimate default point is to want to prevent any other country from being dominant in the main spheres of power in Europe and in Asia. And so even under a different system, I would still see potential for some quite sharp competition between the US and China, and sharp competition between China and its neighbors, because clearly its neighbors, even under a different ideology, do not share that narrative that the 21st century will be one of Chinese domination. They have a very different idea of how the history of the 21st century in Asia should play out. So I see a slightly less optimistic sense of how this would all affect China's relations with the US and with its neighbors than perhaps Minchin has put forward. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you for those excellent comments. Now we'll turn to David Shambaugh.
Well, pleasure to be here, Mark, and thank you. Actually, Mark and I have never met before today, so that's one benefit of today. I've been a great admirer of the Journal of Democracy and Mark's contributions over the years, so it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me to be a commentator. I'd like to start just by commending Minchin on his scholarship over the years to our field and to our understanding of China. And I think you're more than a China scholar, though. You're a public intellectual. You've written a lot in the public domain. You believe in public education, and I commend any scholar that does that. Most scholars don't step out of their little academic world and do what Minchin has done. And your writings over the years have been really influential to me. Personally, your two books, China's Transition, which Jeff just mentioned, and the previous one, From Reform to Revolution, both have been very influential in my own thinking and work. So, and I'm sure that China's crony capitalism and democratizing China are also, when they appear, going to have the same impact. One thing that really stands out, I think, about Minchin's writings and scholarship over the years and distinguishes it from others in the China field is his placing of China in a comparative context. When he went to graduate school, like we all did, we had to take those courses on comparative politics, but he listened more carefully and paid more attention than others. Your mention of Przeworski just now brings back memories of my own doctoral exams at the University of Michigan. So that's really crucial, I think, for all of us, is to place China in comparative context. China may be a distinct country, I like to say, but it is not unique. And it is, and the more it develops, the less uniqueness it has. So I really myself believe that we need to see China through several comparative prisms. First, as a newly industrializing economy. Second, as mentioned, just indicated, as a Northeast Asian developmental state. Third, as a Leninist-type authoritarian political system. Leninist-type systems are a subset of authoritarian systems. And fourthly, maybe democratic transitions. These four prisms, I think it's imperative that we draw on them and use them to try and understand where China is today and where it may be going in the future. I try to do that in this new book of mine as well. They're not a panacea. They're not going to offer us, the crystal ball that's going to answer all the questions about where China is going, but they will, I think, illuminate a lot about the pathways forward, and the challenges that China faces are very similar to those other 4 types of systems I just mentioned. And the ways through those challenges, if there are ways through those challenges, we can learn from the way the 11 newly industrialized countries got through the middle income trap. 11 out of, I think the World Bank says, nearly 100. That means 89 of them stagnated and failed to get through the middle income trap. So we have to, I'll come back to this in my closing comments, transition isn't necessarily the expectation. Stagnation, I'll just tag that now and come back to it, may be more likely. But seeing China comparatively is really, really crucial, I think. So I'd make a plea that we all do that and not just see it as a sui generis country or state. Minchin's core argument in today and in the forthcoming books, as I understand it from what little I've read of it, is similar to mine, or mine is similar to his, actually, in that the regime is fragile and in a state of decay. On that we agree and have for some time. I think where we maybe disagreed before was you never bought into the resilient authoritarianism paradigm in the first place. Whereas I and Andy Nathan and a number of other China watchers did in the 90s and early 2000s. But whenever we date the departure from resilient authoritarianism from, whether it was Bo Xilai, I myself think 2009 was the crucial year. Nonetheless, we all see today China having reverted to this atrophy and decay and fragility, extreme fragility. And I think we need to go a bit further, though, and dissect that fragility and understand what are the core elements of it. That's what Minchin's new book really does, and indeed Trap Transition really did. It was way ahead of its time. It was really a prescient book. I've gone back and reread it several times, and you really were ahead of the curve, Minchin, on identifying the variables and their trajectories inside of China. And you were a lone voice. I have to commend you, too, on your independence of thought and your bravery, quite honestly, in what you write. And you have not always been in the mainstream. Now the mainstream is moving towards you. So we all have to do that, I think. We have to be independent in our thought and say what we believe and not be intimidated by various forces in our professions. So what I'd like to know more about, though, maybe in the role of discussant, is, Minchin, what you think the inflection points are or will be, and the processes of what Andy Nathan called cascading events in his Journal of Democracy article of, 3 years ago? The tipping point article, not the resilient authoritarian article, the tipping point article. What would the inflection points, and if you accept the cascading events imagery, what would that look like? I also share very much Minchin's notion that he gave this morning orally of organizational decay. I've long viewed the CCP primarily through that lens. That's what distinguishes Leninist states from other types of authoritarian states. It's the organizational apparat, right? It's not a sultanate. It's not a personalistic regime. It's not other types of authoritarian regimes. Leninist states are built on the organizational apparatus. So if the organizational apparatus is decaying, which I think we agree it has been for some time, it's sort of like a cancer that is, gradually developing inside the body politique of the system. You can take, a cocktail of cancer drugs and chemotherapy or whatever that can postpone for some time the progression, if you will, if you want to stick with this metaphor, of the disease. But the disease may go into remission, but that's not likely in this case. Question is really how does it progress, and what can the regime do? Well, we've seen. Oh, you argue in the new book, I gather, that there are two determining terminal conditions: repression and patronage. I would agree with those. And you mentioned ideology in your oral comments, or lack of ideology. I just add several other elements that I see when I diagnose the Chinese Communist Party state at the moment, the first of which is, in fact, no ideology. But more importantly, the kind of robotic, feigned compliance, to draw a term from Lucian Pye many years ago, by the cadres and the citizens in the system alike. This is a pretend false kind of, in Chinese they call it biaotai, to declare where you stand. But it's so false that it's very apparent. These cadres don't understand the concepts are hollow in themselves, the concepts change by the week, and it's all they can do to keep up with, gosh, what's the kohao, what's the slogan of this week that we have to internalize and repeat back. I mean, that's not a new phenomenon. I've noticed that. We've all noticed that in going to China and talking to cadres and even citizens. Citizens haven't a clue, and they're not even forced to parrot back the slogans. They're just confused, and they kind of brush it off and say, oh, we don't care what the 3 represents is, or the harmonious society, or whatever the slogan of the week is. But cadres have to do so. It's a theatrical performance but it's so false. That's one thing I would note and add to the diagnosis of the patient. Secondly, elites fleeing the system and hedging behavior, if you want to call it that, in their own personal lives. Standard Chartered Bank estimates that $950 billion left the country last year. That's not overseas direct investment. That's parking of personal assets abroad by the elite. And guess who the elite are in China? Well, they're corporate elites. And guess what characterizes corporate elites in China? They're also party members. So, when any elite begins to have one foot out the door and parking their personal financial assets abroad, witness Panama Papers most recently, have their green cards for their relatives abroad, they have property in Vancouver or wherever, and they're ready to go at a moment's notice, that tells you a lot about their own lack of confidence in their own system. So that's a real telling indicator to me. Third is what I call a Hobbesian society. Nobody in China knows what tomorrow's going to bring. There's a real sense of uncertainty about tomorrow, proverbially tomorrow, and that's whatever they've gained will be taken away from them somehow. So what does that produce? It just produces more of the same behavior. You want to get while you can get it and keep it and get it out of the country. Fourth, this is a party state with historical amnesia. No willingness to admit its grievous errors of the past, and zero tolerance for criticism from abroad or domestically. That's not an indicator of a confident system and confident state. You bury the past, you don't take criticism constructively, and you don't admit that you've ever made a mistake. Have you ever heard the Chinese Communist regime ever admit that they made a mistake? Never once. Even the Cultural Revolution, of which we're about to have the 50th anniversary next week. It's going to be very interesting to see, in fact, will the Chinese regime even acknowledge the Cultural Revolution next week when it passes, and what will they say about it? Will they say, oh, gosh, over 1 million of our citizens were tragically killed and beaten to death, or whatever happened, tortured, and the society went into chaos for 10 years, and all the horrific things the Cultural Revolution brought on that society. Will they mention anything about this next week? I suspect not. Indeed, if you go into the National Museum on Tiananmen Square and you look at the 60-plus years history of the People's Republic of China, there is a gap from 1957 to 1964, when the atomic bomb has exploded. They like to celebrate that. And then there's another gap from 64 to 76, when the Gang of Four is on trial. So there's historical amnesia. There's 20-plus years of the country's history in the National History Museum that's not even up there. So denial. Any regime that is in such denial is in trouble and highly insecure. So this is where comparative perspectives are, again, useful. Let me quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of my heroes, whose book, The Grand Failure, we should all go back and reread. It was published in 1989, 2 years prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Brzezinski describes in there a multi-stage progression of Leninist party states, the last of which he calls post-communist authoritarianism. And in this phase, and I'll quote from him, the regime loses confidence, evinces a deep insecurity, tries to reassert control. Rule becomes rule for rule's sake. The governing rationale is stripped bare to its core, maintaining power, unquote. That was 2 years before the Soviet Union came down, and I think it's a very relevant quotation for us to remember when we look at China today and the repression that is occurring there. A couple other factors I'd add to your list mention. The state-initiated attack on the elite via the anti-corruption campaign, which, however necessary, given the state of corruption in China, which is pervasive, the campaign has been very selective, very capricious, and politically motivated. And lastly, a failure to implement the much-needed structural economic reforms that were outlined in the third plenum package. And, finally, the return to one-man rule. So all these factors characterize China today as a pretty toxic cocktail of existing fragility and accelerated decay in the system. But I'd like to know, how you see that playing out. What are the cascading effects, as Andy Nathan's term would be? Also, we shouldn't definitely not assume the CCP regime is going to go quietly into the night. It's been a nice 67 years, comrade, over to the next dynasty. No, this regime, I've been convinced for a long time, and they have proven themselves, will use extreme force to stay in power. They're not going to go quietly into the night. So the questions are, if and when they use extreme force again, one, will the security services obey? And if the answer is some will and some won't, and one suspects that there will be those that don't, as we saw in 1989, then what are the implications of that? Second question, will the leadership split as it did in 1989? Third, will there be large-scale civic resistance as there was in 1989? And fourth, if the repression is, quote, successful, what about the aftermath? So let me just wrap up. So what should we be looking for going forward into the future? What are my cascading, or sort of my indicators? First, I'd look for laxity in the what I call the coercive apparatus. And these regimes in this stage, they become very repressive, but in some of them, the repressors become a little lax in their jobs. I would note the East German Stasi, for example. I don't know if many of you saw the film The Lives of Others, Das Leben den Anderen, which is a film, yes, but it's pretty accurate, I'm told by a number of my East German friends, that the Stasi just, like that one officer who he was monitoring the playwright, and then he began to sympathize with the playwright, and began to falsify his reports on the playwright, and then he got caught. But watch for laxity in the coercive apparatus. I am not saying there is any laxity today in China. The coercive apparatus is doing its job in spades. But they might get lax. Second, look for a breakdown of the propaganda apparatus, or the feigned compliance with the propaganda apparatus. The cadres may not even be willing to go through the motions. There's already an apparent sort of Humpty Dumpty quality to it. Third, look for accelerated departures of the elites abroad. Fourth, cracks in the leadership as a result of Xi Jinping's own domineering behavior. I cannot believe for a second that the elites in that system are happy with the personalization and centralization and concentration of power that Xi Jinping has undertaken after the previous 3 decades of intentionally trying to disperse that power into a more collective system. So we're going to want to watch the 19th Party Congress next year very carefully. In fact, we should start watching now, because the run-up to that Congress is already beginning. And they may not all fall in line behind the new commander-in-chief. That Congress could become what I call a brokered convention with Chinese characteristics. Also look for bureaucratic pushback. But how do bureaucracies push back? They tend to not implement. That's the most common way bureaucracies push back. They just don't do what they're told to do. They sort of hunker down and don't implement the policies. And then lastly, I agree with Jeff, look for external conflict that goes awry, in which China doesn't achieve what it aims to do. So finally, let's remember the decline of these Leninist regimes is a long-term process. It is not about immediate implosion. It is protracted decay over a long period of time. The Soviet Union began to decay, probably you can date it 1964. It took 27 years for it to come down or to progress to the point where it came down. So I think decay is the right paradigm. Implosion and collapse is the wrong paradigm. I myself want to disassociate myself publicly with the collapse paradigm. That is not how I view China. Nor do I want China to collapse. But decay, progressive decay is the right paradigm. So if that's true, then this state that we find China in today of relative economic stagnation, and the key word there is relative, because any economy that has $10 trillion GDP and growing at even 3%, much less 4 or 5, you can't call that stagnation. But it is an economy that's not making the transitions through the middle income trap and so on that they need to do. So relative economic stagnation, more acute social instability, and greater repression. It could get worse, ladies and gentlemen, than at present. So it's not a pretty picture, to be sure, but I think it's these three variables that we have to watch when we look at the longevity of this regime. So sorry, Mark, I've gone longer than the assigned 10 minutes.
That's okay. Those remarks were very interesting. And I think what I will do is, rather than ask Minchin to respond now, is first open it to questions, but make sure that we have at least 10 minutes at the end for Minchin and also our other speakers to have a chance to make some final comments. Let me put one question again for the end maybe on the table, which is, I was surprised at how little mention there was of Xi Jinping and to what extent he's really changed things until David's remarks toward the end. Does it represent his coming to power and the way he's acted represent an important turn in the road in terms of the Soviet analogy? Is he a kind of Andropov who really fails to do anything, and does that mean there may be a Gorbachev ahead? I don't know. But okay, let me now open it up for questions. First right here, second John Sullivan. Please identify yourselves.
Thank you very much. My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I teach in China, in Guangzhou. Actually, two questions. One, we just heard about Xi Jinping and increasing power. Yet there seems to be a paradox, because there's certainly more visible resistance to what he's doing, certainly in my experience, which goes back to about 1991 in China. And I wonder if you can explain this as a paradox. And two, Jeff Dyer did mention briefly about China's neighbors, but specifically, what would the India-China relationship be a factor in China's future as well?
Hi, John Sullivan with George Mason. Two quick questions, or really one question with two parts. One, could you address Andy Nathan's article that he just published on the dependent middle class? I find that fascinating in the Chinese context, and equally interesting in the Middle East, where that same phenomenon of Ali Nasser elaborated quite deeply as undermining the progression of democratic triggers or triggering events. And then secondly, you have written about crony capitalism, but you didn't really touch on it today. Is the rise of Alibaba and other companies that I would argue may be escaping from the crony network or threatening the crony network a factor of change?
Thank you. Anne Hanakowitz from China Digital Times. You did, especially Professor Shambaugh, briefly talked about Xi Jinping, and I was wondering, the sort of consolidation of power and the anti-corruption campaign, all of these policies of his, do you think, and for everyone on the panel, does that him reacting to this possible, the decline that's already ongoing, or is it in some way precipitating a decline?
Thanks. Those of us who work on China know one thing about not talking about individual leaders, because Chinese leaders don't want to be criticized by name. So when we discuss China, we tend to focus on policies, on the system, and leave the leaders behind. So they shall remain nameless. So I'm not going to, but I think what you've said about Andropov is interesting, because Andropov, when we think about the former Soviet Union, there's this lingering question, could the Soviet Union be saved? Had Andropov not chosen to die 11 months after he was made the general secretary, maybe the system could have gone longer. I think now we have some answers. That is, we do have a similar approach to saving the system in China. That is, you have a much more draconian crackdown on corruption, trying to straighten the system. Of course, it may be too early to tell, but based on the developments of the last 3 years, probably the system is made more brittle because of the policies. And whether he's a system that will decay through a process of internal corruption, and a system that will decay because of the destruction of elite unity. Two very distinct processes, even though they all end up in the same place. So, crony capitalism, well, the paradox of Xi, of strongman, I've observed this paradox as well. This is by far the most powerful leader the Communist Party has had since the end of Mao. But his capacity to get things done actually is very limited. And you ask why? He's encountering the same problem Mao did. That is, the bureaucracy is not online. And if the bureaucracy is not is on your side, it's very hard to get things moving in the Leninist state. And crony capital Alibaba, I don't want me to be sued or Andy to be sued by Alibaba's lawyers. But I think when you look at big capitalists, big entrepreneurs in China, and the New York Times, FT, Bloomberg News have done wonderful investigative stories. What they found is that very large companies, they all have shareholders who are children, family members of the political elites.
Anyone else want to comment on those questions?
On those two, I'd like to maybe comment on your question about the anti-corruption campaign. If I understood it correctly, you asked, is it a reaction to the decay of the Communist Party, or is it a cause of the decay? And that's very perceptive. The answer is both. The corruption was so pervasive that it had to be dealt with. It wasn't. This is not the first anti-corruption campaign, by the way. You go back and you look at the way both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao began their terms. They started with what? Anti-corruption campaigns. And they lasted about 12 months each. So this one has obviously lasted longer, and it's far more intense. It's unprecedented. And it may reflect the unprecedented degree of corruption in the system, which means the military as well. 4,000 officers and 82 generals have been taken down in the military. But it's just throughout the system, the corporate system, the party system, the government system. So it's necessary. Yes, that's a reflection of the decay on that. If Xi Jinping were sitting here at the table, he would agree that the party's in decay on the corruption side and has to be dealt with.
He has published a book on this, and I quoted from it voluminously in my new book. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
But it is, and I argue myself, that it's having unintended consequences or collateral consequences. The campaign is that it's freezing up the bureaucracy, It's not, therefore, that's having an economic impact. The reforms of the third plenum are not getting implemented. It's got the fear factor. You wrote one of the most perceptive articles I've read recently called China's Culture of Fear.
China's rule of fear.
China's rule of fear. And if you go to China and you talk to not just cadres in the system and party members, but others, there is this overhang of fear that they contrast with the Cultural Revolution. So that's been a consequence of the system, and it's been very selective. The prosecution of the campaign has been quite selective. When you have such a broad phenomenon of corruption that widespread, then the question is, who do you go after? And that is a decision that is based on other criteria. And finally, I'd observe that the corruption campaign is dealing only with the consequences of corruption, what you might call the behavioral manifestations of corruption, bad lifestyle, villas, mistresses, cars, foreign bank accounts. That's all what you do once you're corrupt. They aren't dealing at all with the sources and the systemic causes of corruption in the system. So just in response there, I don't want to take too long, but the Soviet question is very interesting. The Chinese have spent very long time studying the causes of collapse of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and there were basically two schools that came out of that study. First school was that the Soviet Union, by the time Gorbachev came along, the system was too decayed, too fragile, and it couldn't take the shock therapy of Gorbachev's reforms, and therefore that produced the implosion. But they were not critical of the reform, all the reforms. They just said the system couldn't take the shock. So their conclusion, that school, was you have to start early, manage opening progressively, incrementally over a long period of time, and therefore you can stay in power as a soft authoritarian state. The second school says, you cannot manage opening. It will cascade out of your control. So my theory is that in 2009, school number one gave way to school number two. We had seen 10 years of attempted managed opening, authoritarian resilience, that ended for a variety of reasons we don't have the time to go into. And since then, we've seen school number two come in and say, don't open the system at all. If you try to do so, you can't control it, and then we will fall from power. So the Soviet perspective is really important to understanding what the Chinese communists have been doing.
I want to ask two questions. One of them is a bit skeptical. The first one, though, is not skeptical. It's just factual. The Chinese government has been looking at Singapore as a way to manage a softer authoritarian regime, and I guess, to judge by the recent article in the JOD, it's concluded that Singapore is a small place. You can't really generalize from that place to a much bigger place. But nobody on the panel today spoke about Taiwan as a model either rejected or considered kind of tempting or any kind of model at all. And I'd love to know what the regime is thinking about Taiwan. I have the feeling that the crackdown in Hong Kong presages something very bad for Taiwan. My second question, which you'll forgive a little bit of skepticism. Up here, okay. Actually, my second question has to do with signaling, yes. Should it be up or down? How do we know the bureaucracy isn't complying? It's a kind of, this goes back to my graduate school education in Soviet politics, which I was, I must say, wise enough to abandon. Do we know that the bureaucracy really isn't complying? And what about the military? Have there been efforts to shore up the military or to identify reliable units who can do a Tiananmen Square type suppression? Because that was very carefully done with particular units. What I'm saying is that we have boxes that have been filled in, but we need to see what the evidence really looks like in these boxes. The more so because we're talking about prediction rather than post-diction.
I'm Alim Sida from the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Just one question. During the past party congress, the Zhang Chunxian, the party secretary of Xinjiang, or China's ruler to rule our homeland, East Turkestan, when foreign reporters asked him whether he supported Chinese President Xi Jinping as a core leader. He said, instead of saying yes, he said, I'll see. See, he basically open defied Chinese President Xi Jinping right after the party congress without any hesitation. This was reported by a lot of Chinese media in the US and other countries, but not in the mass media. To me, as a Uyghur who see him, this brutal dictator basically to rule the Uyghur people, could openly defy China's this powerful leader who shows himself so powerful now. What does it mean? What he said, and he's not punished, he's not demoted, or he's not forced to resign. He's still ruling our East Turkestan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David Machinist, State Department. There was a lot of discussion about external factors being in play in terms of the decay of the regime, but I'm wondering about the opposite in the sense that external factors being a way that the regime is able to continue its presence. I think this week Freedom House released a report about the decline in press freedom in 2015. We've seen a lot of democracies in Southeast Asia sort of go backwards. We've seen the emergence of China, bringing in these new international institutions, the AIIB, and sort of influencing other international organizations. I'm just wondering what kind of thoughts you have on this issue as well, too. Thank you.
Maybe I'll take the bureaucracy question, if I may, which is it's a fascinating one. I thought David outlined extremely well the kind of 4 or 5 most sensitive points. Are we seeing lots of people leaving the country? Are we seeing cracks in the leadership? Are we seeing the propaganda apparatus breaking down? Cracks in the Secret Service? And then the military question you raised as well. These are all absolutely the pressure points to be looking at, with the exception of are people leaving the country, which clearly they are. Clearly there's lots of money leaving. Clearly there's a real rush to get hold of foreign passports. The kind of very well-informed people in the US government would caution us from reading too much into any of these other indicators. So while clearly there are good reasons to think there might be pressure, splits in the leadership because of just the extent of the anti-corruption campaign, we have to be very careful that we don't overanalyze and overwish some of this stuff. These are, as both mentioned and David have said, these are long-term trends. They're the things that are likely to rot the system from within, but they're not things that necessarily going to trip it up tomorrow. And so we have to be a little bit careful that we don't overinterpret some of the data we're seeing. The military one is in some ways the hardest thing to get a handle on. And your precise question of whether there's a new Shandong infantry group that has been given the job to move into Tiananmen Square if there's the repression, we have no idea whatsoever. But generally my sense is that the relationship with the military has been refashioned in quite an effective way, where the military has pulled out of more overt interference in domestic politics, but it's been given 30 years of 10% budget increases, and given all this new kit. It's been given a chance to start achieving some of these regional ambitions that Chinese have. And so their underlying mentality at the moment is one of a certain kind of proud nationalism that's quite skeptical at America. And they want to show themselves off as being an effective military. They're not so much a political actor anymore. They want to be seen as good professional soldiers who are very capable. And so the mixture of that reorganizing the political apparatus and giving them this big investment has refashioned them in a way that is potentially keeping them on side as a very loyal actor too.
Thank you.
Two questions. The one about Zhang Chunxian, I wouldn't take anything reported in the non-official media seriously, because it's impossible to verify. But I think how Chinese leaders, this is getting into inside baseball, elite politics. This involves a very special term. This is actually a very important development. We are all watching how Xi Jinping is officially, what should I say, titled by his peers. And right now it's a very ambiguous picture. Now, I want to respond to Taiwan question because I get this all the time. Taiwan was governed by an authoritarian regime. China is still ruled by a quasi-totalitarian, post-totalitarian regime. These two are different species, totally different species. The Taiwan, I'm sure the Chinese leaders have taken a look at Taiwan. I say, totally irrelevant to us because if we become Taiwan, we lose the power. So, so that's why I think external factors. I think some external. It's mixed. I looked at external factors. Some external factors can precipitate change toward a more open society, but other external factors can impede. And the Chinese Communist Party is very good at exploiting Chinese nationalism. In fact, in thinking about this, Chinese nationalism is really wild card in this game. Yeah. Do they want to be Chinese, or do they want to be Chinese and democratic, or do they want to be something else? Yeah.
David?
Well, I just add on the Taiwan, I agree with Minchin on the Taiwan analogy. I just would point out the parallel between Taiwan's transition from Chiang Kai-shek to Jiang Jingguo. That's where China is today, coming right up to that, from hard authoritarian to, Jiang Jingguo did not institute democracy in Taiwan. Jiang Jingguo instituted soft authoritarianism in Taiwan that led to democracy when Li Denghui came to power. At least that's my reading and understanding of the transition. So, it's hard to soft to democracy, at least in Taiwan's experience. So it was moving up to that transition point in 2009. Now they backed away from it. They're hunkering down, so I think we need to but I agree with Minchin, when the mainland leadership and even mainland people look at Taiwan, it is not an example. They see it as chaotic, which it has been until democracy was flourishing or maturing in recent years. On the military, though, that's what I'd like to respond to. This is a crucial institution for the regime to stay in power, has been all along, still is, but Xi Jinping is, I would argue, stressing the military severely through three ways. First of all, personally, he's been demanding, it's always been a party army, but now there's some indications that it's becoming a more personalistic relationship with the military. It's not just the party as an institution. He has demanded loyalty oaths from the officer corps. He had this appearance last week. He has added a new title, the Commander-in-Chief, and he dressed up in fatigues and boots. I wonder when the last time he had boots on were. But, so he's trying to put his own personal stamp on the military as he is elsewhere. The second thing is the organizational reorganization, sweeping, massive, unprecedented reorganization of the 4 general departments and the CMC and the way the military has been organized since the Soviet Union organized it in the first place in the 1950s. We have to realize this is the last vestige of the Soviet, well, not the last, SOEs are the last, but major vestige of the Soviet influence. So what happened in January is really shaking up, and I can't believe that there's not a lot of pushback and bureaucratic inertia and vested interests and iron rice bowls that are being broken here. In the process of reorganizing the upper levels of the PLA, not the military regional commands. That's another issue from a military perspective. Can they move to real joint operations and so on? Finally, the ethos of the officer corps, because of the anti-corruption campaign, as I mentioned. 4,000 officers and 82 generals, that's their statistics, not mine. That has got to do something to the core, ethos and loyalty in the officer corps. So I'm not certain. I don't think we can say that Xi Jinping has command of the Chinese military. That's a question. That's a big question in my mind.
I wonder, David, a couple of times you referred to 2000.
This is Minchin's show today. I want him to speak, but I'll give you my quick. There are four factors that happened in 2008 and 9 that shifted the whole trajectory of the regime. First factor was the retirement of Zheng Qinghong in 2008. I see Zheng Qinghong as a real political reformer. He was the one who laid out, first of all, the diagnosis of the collapse of the Soviet Union at the Fourth Plenum in 2004, gave a big speech, and then he wrote and began to implement the decade-long movement towards soft authoritarianism. That's my analysis. I'm not sure Minchin or others would agree with that, but Zheng Qinghong was the patron of the first camp of the post-Soviet collapse, and then he had to retire for age reasons. So he had no benefactor, he had no patron for the program. Second factor was the Charter 08. That happened in 08, of course. That the regime felt mildly threatened by. But then we had the riots in Tibet in the late spring, right, of 08. March 08. Then we had repeat riots in Urumqi in July 09. Jeff was probably out there covering them. Then we had in between we had Arab Spring and the threat of jasmine spreading, and the Chinese government got very strict about that during that period. Then we have bureaucratic factors, I would argue. The coercive apparatus led by Zhou Yongkang, and the SOEs, and the propaganda apparatus and the military, what I call the Iron Quadrangle. Those four well-funded, very strong bureaucracies found common cause in stopping the managed opening. So they said, no, this is going to cascade our control. Our budgets are going to shrink. We need them to grow. And there's big money in repression. So I think those, and then there was the parade in October or September of 2010. And finally, the global financial crisis. The Chinese got very drunk on their own China model notions of Zhongguo Mosher. So there was and Hu Jintao, finally, last factor. You have a weak leader who is steamrolled by other leaders and bureaucratic actors. They all came together. Jeff was living there then. I happened to be living there that year, and you could sense it. You talk to Chinese in different parts of the system, and they were all feeling the change. So that was a kind of crucial transition year, in my view. That's a shorthand.
Almost just to sort of redouble on what David was just saying, because I think it's quite important how it reflects on the role of Xi Jinping in all this. As David mentioned, I was living in Beijing at the same time as he was. And particularly 08 and 09 really was, to me, the time when things really changed, when the emotional temperature of the country changed. And my two sort of top moments are the Tibet riots of March 08, which really empowered in an important way the more hardline sort of security apparatus elements within the system and sidelined the reformers. And then the global financial crisis, I think, was also a fundamental important moment, because there had always been a sort of debate within China about what do we do when we are a powerful country? Are we going to push back against the United States, or are we going to integrate into the US-led world? That had always been a kind of theoretical discussion. But the global financial crisis pushed that to the forefront, and people started saying, this is something we have to decide now and debate now. This is about the present and the future. It's not about something in the long-term future. It's about today. So those are the two things that really, to my mind, shifted the axis and how the state functioned and how China thought about itself. As a result of that, it's very easy to focus exclusively on Xi Jinping because of the utterly dramatic nature of the anti-corruption campaign, and because of his centralization of power, and just because of almost his sense of swagger, and just because no one quite understands who he's talking to, and so even analysis of China has become much less about the standing committee. It's about who's in Xi's kitchen cabinet. But to me, it's a much deeper process. The window for reform that was maybe open in the 2000s started to close in 08, 09. It didn't just close when Xi Jinping started to become more repressive in the last couple of years. And so that just moving to a different leader will not necessarily reopen that prospect for reform.
Thanks. And then Minchin?
Well, 2 points. One about cascading events. I think we really need to watch for. There are many things to watch in China, but leadership. If you have to pick one thing, just look at leadership, top leadership. Luckily, we have 2 transition points coming up next year, 19th Party Congress, and 22, the 20th Party Congress. And we can learn a lot about where China is going just by looking at who are in control. And second, I completely agree with David is that we are watching a process. We're not predicting an event. That's why I'm often identified with Gordon Chang's as Gordon Chang's cousin. However, I disagree with Gordon. I think I don't deserve to be labeled as a forecaster of China's collapse. I've never used collapse. I don't think David. No respectable analysts would use the word collapse because they're going to simply look like fools because events cannot be forecast. Process can be analyzed. We are analyzing process, and decay is a process. It's not. But let's just say, but a decaying organism eventually has to turn to something will happen to a decaying organism. And now I want to use something we hear from Wall Street. That it often we talk about how market turns. Markets can remain distorted for a long, long time. It often takes longer than you think. Okay, but when it turns, it moves much faster than you expect. I think this is this. If you remember the wisdom implied in this the phrase, I think it will be we will be very well prepared to how things pan out in China.
All right, we'll be watching. We've been warned now. Thank you to our panelists for I thought was a great discussion. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much.
I thought that was really a wonderful discussion, but are we missing out if you invited a couple of other people around town? Would we have gotten a completely different view?
Thank you.
You should. There are other views. Everybody, the spectrum is shifted, but there are other views. There are people who are more like